Hey, Kaga back again. Today we're going to talk about Final Fantasy XIV. And the reason I'm going to make this video is simply because I just want to share my thoughts on the current state of the game since I've been playing for a long time, on and off for years. My total playtime in the game as of today is 126 days, 8 hours and 44 minutes. That's a pretty substantial time to invest in a game. And mainly, I do love the game. I really do. It's a fun game, but with recently dumbed down versions of dungeons and mechanics and everything else, I think the player base has suffered, and suffered significantly. And let me start off by saying about the sprout status. I don't care how long you played the game, if you reach the end game, you by default should have no sprout status. It is so ridiculous for me to see at the Endwalker's last goddamn dungeon seeing sprout statuses. So by default I think you should lose sprout status when you reach endgame content, as in if the last expansion is Endwalker currently, then the last main scenario quest of Endwalker, the base, not the content afterwards, but the base Endwalker story finished, you lose your sprout status. Now with that out of the way, let's talk about high-end players, shall we? I'm not talking about those that do ultimate raids or extreme savage raids and so on. Those are a group of people that know what they're doing. I'm talking about the daily players, the ones that run dungeons at level 90, not knowing what their basic mechanics of classes do. I've seen so many people with level 90 not knowing what Bloodbath does, not knowing what an AoE is, not knowing what a black mage can also use fire AoEs, not just ice AoEs. I could go on for hours pointing out points what I've seen with recently. And that brings back me to the point that I think that when you dumb down the game to a more casual audience, let's say, in a sense it would help bring more people into the game. But I also think that the game suffers with that. When I was started out Final Fantasy XIV, I loved how the community pointed out my mistakes. I'm a main tank in the game. Always has been, always will be. The first time I ran Stone Vigil was the first time somebody pointed out to me that I need to face the boss around the party, because that was the first boss that was kind of facing the party. Usually I kind of accidentally was away from the party, or the party more likely positions themselves away. In that dungeon, they let me know I need to face the mob away from the party. That's tank basics. Now, there's the type of player base that I like, where they help out with your mistakes and stuff. What I don't like is the current player base. When you do tell them that you have to do this in order for the party not to suffer damage, or point out basic things like you have to do in this mechanic, it's like, I watched a guide, I did this, I did that, and why don't do the mechanics then? Why do you not have the basic knowledge of said thing you just said you have basic knowledge of? Do you just ignore that? And while we're at it, let's talk about bots. And I'm not talking people that are so bad I would call them bots, but actual AI bots, like automated dungeon running. Because yesterday when I was running a dungeon, I ran into a case. There should be some way to report this. I wanted to report that player. And I'm not talking about going into the forums and reporting it that way. In-game. There should be a way to report it in-game. I don't care if you introduce a some sort of punishment system if people abuse that, but there should be a way to let the developers or whoever oversees all of this in Final Fantasy that people ran into such instances, because that was definitely a bot, because he stood in every mechanic possible. Not saying it's a bad thing. He didn't react to anything. He didn't do any mechanics, and all he was doing is blasting AoEs. And instead of running away from mechanics, he ran into the mechanics. And when there was friendly AoE line, the dungeon in specific would be level 80 Dungeon Pagalthan or something like that. I'm not sure how to really pronounce it. You have the dragon spout his line AoE to damage the 2 mobs you can grab. And in that, he went ahead and tried to pull it out. And I'm not saying that there is not people who would try to do that, but combined with what I saw in that dungeon, made me believe that that was not an actual human playing the game. It really seemed like it was some bot program running that auto farms from dungeons. And now let's talk about the player base more. In a sense of, I understand early levels, it is fine for you to not know your classes. But I am a bit sick of seeing level 90 multiple classes not knowing what an AoE button is in an AoE situation. Or like I stated earlier, the DPS knowing what Bloodbath is. People should just read what their skills do. I've never seen any DPS since they introduced Feint use a feint on anything, but they will blast Bloodbath like it's some sort of an attack enhancement buff. But all it does is restore your health on hit. That's all it does. And when you actually need it, they don't have it because they blast it constantly. I am honestly convinced that at this point people are just pressing buttons as soon as they are available to be pressed. Which is a good thing in a general sense, but to some skills it's not really that good. Like I mentioned, Bloodbath, you would need it in certain situations if you mess up the mechanic or anything, or the healer doesn't pay much attention to you as a DPS and you don't receive any heals, then you would have Second Wind or Bloodbath to kind of heal yourself a little bit until healer notices or something. Now another thing is for tanks. I honestly don't like the recent tanks, and as I stated, I'm a main tank. They use provoke in single boss fights where he didn't die, wasn't rezzed or anything, he had full on aggro but keeps spamming provoke. Like, that's not really an issue in the gameplay in general. It's just my type of niche, you might call it. It's like, why are you using provoke when you should just leave it off? You're the only one that's driving the aggro. As long as your tank stance is on and you haven't been rezzed, there should be no reason to have provoke. Provoke should be used in a situation if you do wipe and the healer rezzes, then you use a provoke to get the aggro back real quickly. And the amount of tanks nowadays that don't know that you can use AoE in AoE situations to use to keep aggro is a bit saddening for me, because I generally think in an AoE situation you just use AoEs. If you have played other MMOs where I also played other MMOs where the AoEs weren't like in this, it was easier to keep aggro with single targeting, and just AoEs were primarily used for grabbing them. at the first phase. Final Fantasy works a bit different. And this is not like a low-level player base I'm talking about that don't use AoEs in group situations, but like 80, 90 level players. It's like, if you are gonna single target, I have no problem with that. I do have a problem with is the fact that you grab with an AoE, then you single target a single mob. You will lose aggro on the rest of the mobs because you do not pay attention to the aggro. You have a monster list which you can then use to gauge whether you have the aggro or you do not. Red on the mob means you got it, yellow means you're losing it, green you lost it. You don't have aggro. Now for a tank, all of them should be red. Obviously. He's supposed to take the damage for the party. And while we're talking about tanks, let's talk about player base towards tanks. Let's talk about the fact that if you run as a DPS, do not try to pull the mobs. Yes, it might be boring if you have a tank that grabs only the way the mobs are dispensed through the dungeon. Wall-to-wall pulls are the best. And let me tell you right now, with the healer I'm constantly playing with, I can run all the dungeons almost, except some of the 90 dungeons where I need to pop one defensive skill. Most of the dungeons you can run without using any healing skills, defensive skills, as a tank and a healer can easily deal with it. Not saying that's the current state of the player base in healers in general, but that's how, from my experiences with the healer, I constantly run dungeons. I don't even use defensives. Very rarely, in case something goes wrong with the pull. And on some certain level 90 dungeons, that they do hit like a truck. So then I use one defensive. Now for the general, before the level 90 stuff, where only Shadowbringers was still a thing, I ran dungeons with just using one big defensive, one small defensive. So let's say a rampart and arm's length, per example. It's not straight up defensive, but it slows down the attack rate of the enemies, which is usually more than enough then to deal with the group, if the DPS are actually using AoE skills. But what I dislike is if a tank pulls only one group of mobs at a time. It's not really a pull, it's just how they're designed in the dungeon. You as a DPS should not go and pull another group of mobs, or go ahead and run in front of the dungeon. Yes, you may have the experience to run the dungeon, but you're not the tank. The tank leads the group. You wanna run ahead, lead a group, play a tank instead of a DPS. If not, then respect the tank and follow his pace. The only thing I would say is you could ask the tank to like step up the pace or something like that, and if the tank agrees, then it's fine. If not, then it's not. As for the only thing that I think would make me say that you can kind of step those bounds over a tank is if you play a healer. You both are the main roles. You're essentially the lifeline of the party. If either one of you goes down, you are a potential wiping situation, depending on the situation and the pulls you're in. Now, a quick healer can res a tank still, and the tank can still pull the group, if in the case the tank wipes, without wiping the whole party. Been in those situations many times. But that's not always the case, so if either one of you wipes, there is the potential the whole party wipes. That's what I mean by them being the main roles. Now back to my point. I think the healer is the only one that should be able to sort of encourage the tank to go faster. When I play healer and a tank doesn't pull a whole bunch of mobs together, I honestly feel bored. And I know a lot of people are gonna say healers are supposed to DPS. Dungeons go way faster if you pull all the group and you mostly focus on healing instead of DPSing. In my opinion, if you're a healer, you should heal. If you're not healing, well then either the tank is not pulling enough mobs, or there's just not enough mobs left for you to really heal. Now, which is why I do dislike these videos online about Final Fantasy healer abuse where you wall to wall pull. I understand that it's like for you may not be skilled enough or don't feel enough confident enough in your skills to heal these big pulls, but then let the tank know when the tank can just not pull them. I've been in those situations where I jump into a dungeon and the healer is like, can you pull less? Or in cases where I queued for the same dungeon and the same healer was there and they were like, this time can you pull less? Like, I understand not a lot of people like stressful situations or like to deal with only just healing in itself as a primary thing. They would like to DPS as well. There's a multitudes of people playing the game with their own preference and playstyles. Now, at the same time, the end game dungeons, they're very simple in how you tank and heal. You wall-to-wall pull, and a healer mostly focuses on healing. If you can throw in a DPS skill in between, you're free to welcome to do so. But that's a decision you make on the spot as the healer, whether you need to heal the tank or not. Now, let's talk about the game a bit more, in the sense that with the dumbed down things. Like I said, I've been playing the game for a couple of years now, on and off. And back then, when I started out, the general player base knew what to do with dungeons. They knew the basic mechanics of their classes. And although I will say that the summary adjustments that they did, I do like. Like the previous summoner, I didn't exactly like because of his demanding rotation. But the current summoner, I kinda like because it's simple, but simple doesn't always equal good. And I think the game has gotten to the point where it's so simple, where it's just not challenging enough for people to improve. Like, if you have at least a healer who can keep up the tank's health, and a tank who knows how to grab things and know the basic mechanics of the dungeon, or the mechanics of the bosses in general, you can easily do a dungeon, even if the DPS wiped 20 times over. So it's gotten to the point where you don't actually need to improve on the game as long as there is at least one person that knows something. And if you're a healer main and you know everything how to heal a tank who can wall-to-wall pull, and you have a tank who doesn't pull mobs at all and just doesn't know mechanics in general, you can still solo the dungeon essentially by keeping up your party's health. That's how easy the game is on base dungeons. Obviously, if you go to something like Extreme Trials or Ultimate Raids or anything of like high-end level, obviously you need to know what you're doing, otherwise your whole party suffers. But like I said earlier, this is about the general dungeon runs, the general player base, the base content, so to speak. And I honestly dislike some decisions they made. Like them removing Kaiten from Samurai it sucks, but it's also not that important. I do dislike what they did with classes in general. If before classes felt unique, and let's say Samurai was known for its damage and Monk was known for its speed, per example, then now it's like if I play Samurai or Monk or any other DPS class that's a melee DPS, besides the skills looking different, they play the same. There is no uniqueness to them anymore. It's like you played one class, you played all classes, which is simple in general. That means you don't have to relearn the class or remember the class how it worked, which simplifies things. But like I said before, simple doesn't equal good. The changes they've been making are not that great, in my opinion. I mean, what happens? Okay, I'm a veteran. Then you simplify the game down. It brings in new people. They become veterans. You simplify even more, include even more people. Until you'll simplify it so much that you'll have no player base because the game will not be fun anymore. And I think the general issue of why so many people are unskilled nowadays in the game is because it is so simple. It's like, why should they learn how to play their class if all they can do is spam attack 1 and they'll do the dungeon? And it's like, why should one bother to learn how to properly play a class if the content is not challenging to the point where it's like not even worth learning the class? I mean, it's even so simple as when you press a button, it pops up the next button you can press in order to even enhance your attack. So as long as you do your essential 1, 2, 3 combo for most classes, you'll do fine on single targets. If you throw in AoEs, well, you're already above like 90% of the player base at this point. That I've personally encountered. Not saying all players are like that. Just my personal encounters. And with that, it is sad to see the game go this way. Because I'm not saying the previous dungeons were challenging, were really challenging or anything, but at least there were mechanics. At least players back then knew generally what a stack marker is. There were memes around that sprouts don't know what a stack marker is. Well, now the meme could be switched that mentors don't know what a stack marker is. I've had a much easier time running dungeons with sprouts nowadays than I do with mentors, battle mentors. They think they know how to run a dungeon, but they honestly know less than a sprout in most cases. Just because they have that mentor status, they think they know better than you, and because they know they think better than you, they do not listen to you when you tell them you're doing the mechanic wrong, so you end up wiping multiple times over. Which is why I don't like mentors nowadays. And I honestly think they should rethink how they go with the game forward, because if they continue going the simplified route of the game, then I honestly think it's gonna arrive to the point where there will be no player base left. The game is still fun, but I honestly think if it gets any more simple than it is currently, then that will be the point for me where I will say that the game isn't fun anymore. It honestly is already so overly simple that you could be half asleep and you could still do dungeons easily. That's why I think it would be better if they brought in more mechanical demanding dungeons where mechanics actually matter more. Instead, bring back good dungeons. Like, honestly speaking. They dumbed down dungeons that were fine to begin with. Mechanics that didn't need reorganizing. They removed them completely from dungeons. Stone Vigil was fine as it was. They went and changed it to an even more simple version. It was, for me, Stone Vigil back then was the changing point in the content basically. It's like, was the first sort of demanding dungeon back then. Now Stone Vigil is a joke. Most dungeons are a joke. Like I said, I do dungeons without even using defensives, and we do it just fine without anybody being in real danger. at most you might need a defensive nowadays. If you really want to be sure, it's like I said, one big defensive, one small defensive. This video is just going to be a basic giant rant about the game. I don't care. Now back to the player base. Let's start with DPS. For DPS, I honestly would just say, read your skills. Learn what a bloodbath is. I wouldn't mind if they were spamming feint because that helps defensives on a single mob, but bloodbath doesn't help you at all when you're full health. It doesn't increase your damage, it doesn't do anything of the sort, which I honestly think most player base thinks that bloodbath increases your damage as a DPS, which doesn't. And also learn the fact that you can use AoEs in AoE situation. Like before I recorded this video, I ran a level 84 dungeon, I think, 80 something dungeon, and the summoner was just single targeting mobs the whole time. I honestly think you have no excuse on not knowing what an AoE button is once you're level 50. By that, you should have your basics down on a single target and AoE skills. But there's a lot of people at level 90, level 80s that still don't know what an AoE button is. Now to move on to the tanks. For them, it's really, in general situation, it's for tanks, it's just for them to be more confident. Nowadays people refuse to pull more than one group of mobs. Like I said, if you meet the first 3 units in the dungeon, they stop there and DPS there. I would say tanks would need to be more courageable, encouraged, I don't know the right word for it, be more brave and pull more. If you wipe with the first pull, then slow it down. But if not, then the healer can handle it and you can pull the rest of the dungeon the same way. It makes for more fun gameplay in my opinion when I heal, if I have to heal you more often than it is for me to pressing a DPS button. If I want a DPS, I'll just play a DPS. That's why there is such a class available. I play healer to heal. And like I said, as a tank, it's also for me more fun when I pull a bunch of mobs, when I get to dodge those AoE markers more often than just sitting there with 3 mobs and they pop up once a minute maybe. It's more interesting for me in those situations. Like I said, not everybody will feel like it. And I honestly think if you make a game for everybody, then it is a game for nobody. Because it's like, you're not gonna make a game that everybody likes. You can make a game that a lot of people like, but not everybody will like it. And at this point, I think that Final Fantasy is trying to make, Square Enix is trying to make a game that is for everybody. Which at this point, Final Fantasy will die out. Just make a game for people that enjoy that type of game you're making, instead of trying to appeal to this wider audience, which you think might be good, but in the long run it won't be, because the game will be so dumbed down that there will be nothing to do. And obviously, back to the tanks, is the fact that they should know the mechanics. If you run the dungeon the first time, then let the party know you're running the first time. Then those that have run it before can explain some mechanics to you if need be. If not, you can discover it on the fly, which is how I usually tackle new dungeons. I on the fly most of the dungeon mechanics discover. There are some dungeon mechanics that are not so obvious, then I might get hit by them, but in general basis you can figure out the dungeon mechanic easily. And for healers, I would say there's nothing too bad to say about the general healer base. If one thing is fine, is the healers. besides the healers that prioritize DPS over healing. I cannot even say in numbers how many times I've seen a white mage just focus on blasting holy instead of healing tank. And when they let the tank die, they can't even res him, because they like to spam swift cast holy instead of using the swift cast on the tank when they let him die. Like honestly, swift cast is not one thing you should use when you're not paying attention to the tank's health. You wipe the party that way. And I'm not saying that's just a white mage thing, primarily white mages. A lot of healers do that. And that's my biggest issue with healers currently, is the basic fact that they do not heal. They think they can be a third DPS, and I honestly think that a lot of people choose to be a healer just to skip the queue for a dungeon and just be there to DPS. And I mean, it's fine if you want to do it in a group of your friends, but your basic role is healing. So how about you focus on that instead of DPS? For that we have 2 DPSs in a dungeon to begin with. Well, theoretically 3 if you count the tank, because there's nothing really more than for him to hit it. The mobs. That's as basic as tank gets. And that's generally my issue with the current player bases. They don't know their basics. Learn your basics. And don't be entitled. Like, if you're a healer, then heal. And if somebody points out that you didn't heal him because you were too busy DPSing, don't take it personally. That is what you did. And if a tank doesn't grab mobs because he was not paying attention to the monster bar, and somebody calls him out, he's at fault too. The same as DPS not dodging mechanics when they've seen the mechanic 20 times already. And somebody calls them out, they also at fault. Don't take it personally, learn from it. But too many people nowadays take everything so personally that even if you just tell them that way to avoid a mechanic, they will be like, don't teach me how to play, I already know. Or I watched a guide. And that brings me back to the point a while ago I thought about. If you do watch a guide, or if you do really know the mechanics, then why are you getting hit by them so often? Because to me, all that seems to do is the fact that you don't know the mechanics. And I think I've rambled long enough, so I'm gonna end the video here for today. So see you guys next time.